Okay, thanks. So our first respondent, it's Dr. Henry Lorif, with the senior lecturer in maths and applied mathematics at UCT. I'll give you 20 minutes, Henry, and you could respond. Thank you.
It's obviously a bit difficult to respond. Such an enthusiastic and lively presentation. Is this better? I'm mindful that this is a decolonizing space, and I feel a little odd that someone like me should be given the first response. I certainly fall into a category of great privilege when it comes to colonizing. I'm not only am I male and well-educated and a white person from South Africa, but I'm even Afrikaans in my original language. My father was a member of the Broederbond. And when I have a lot of history which is not entirely consistent with that. So I feel a little uncomfortable about being told that my identity is that I'm white, for instance, that people know what that means. But the one thing that I feel most uncomfortable with is when people ask me, well, what do you do? And I say, well, I'm a mathematician. And then you just see the shutters come down. Because for most people, it's a very weird thing to be talking to a mathematician. Their memories of mathematics at school are not happy. and they immediately subscribe. One of the most common things that people tell me is, oh, you must be very clever. And I think that it's a very cultural prejudice. It's much more common in countries that are dominated by English than it is in other countries. So if you go, for instance, to China or Japan, people certainly believe that some people are better at mathematics than others, but they don't believe that in order to do well in mathematics, you have to be clever. It's a completely different attitude. And so when we are here and we're talking about decolonizing, I think it's very important to try and get to a space where you don't respond to what someone says by way of, first, you stereotype them. First, you know whether you're going to agree with them based on how you see them before you've heard what they had to say. So there's a lot that I want to agree with Professor Raju. I certainly agree that if we want to decolonize, then we've got to become independent thinkers. I don't agree with him that colonization was primarily a matter of education. I think it was primarily a matter of guns and murder, for that matter. I think that a lot of decolonization has already happened. And when people talk about decolonizing, it's important to be really clear what you want to do, what you want to achieve. I think there are lots and lots of different definitions of what decolonizing is or what you're trying to do. I don't pretend that I can tell people what they should think decolonizing is. I also think there's a kind of a generational thing. People of my age and people that are really in the student movement and the young people, we are in a different place. I'm not going to have to live in a world where Muizenberg is underwater. I currently live in Muizenberg, but in 100 years' time, Muizenberg will be partly underwater. It's entirely likely that the railway line is not going to be running unless drastic things are done. This is a reality that very few people seem to want to think about. If I think about what the most urgent problems is for the young generation over the period of their lives, then that, I think, is a really important conversation which I'm not hearing. So it's a little difficult to respond to Professor Raju in that context. In terms of mathematics, Professor Raju says that formal mathematics is anti-empirical. And I was thinking, how would I want to introduce mathematics to a general audience? Maybe people whose experience of mathematics at school was not pleasant. And I was thinking of the game of broken telephone, right? So you've all played, more or less, most of you anyway, played broken telephone. One person whispers into another person's ear, they repeat what they've heard, they repeat what they've heard, and you get to the end, and then you compare the original with the final. And the difference is very striking, often very funny. So, the comparison I want to make is with your cell phone. When you talk on your cell phone, when you send a message on your cell phone, there are lots of steps, from cell phone to the nearest cell phone tower, and many steps along the way. This is exactly like broken telephone. The message gets sent from one to the other. But unlike broken telephone, it comes out correct. Why? The answer is formal mathematics. We would not have computers, we would not have the supercomputer that Professor Raju mentioned that he worked on, if we did not have formal mathematics. The whole project of formalizing mathematics resulted in the design of computers. People like Alan Turing and John von Neumann, who were central to the early stages of making computers, were able to do that because of their mastery of the formalisms of formal logic. And the reason why Bertrand Russell takes 328 pages to prove that 1 and 1 is 2 is not because he had a theological impulse. Bertrand Russell would be the last person in the world to have a theological impulse. The reason is that there were problems with the formalization of logic. It was a really difficult thing to do, and a lot of people participated in that. And it was in the attempt to fix the problems that Russell was moved to say, we will base everything on really simple logic, and we will try and deduce everything in mathematics from purely logical principles. And this included, by the way, getting numbers. So this was just a sideline of the total project of what he was trying to do. It wasn't just Russell, he had a co-author, Alfred North Whitehead, so it was the two of them doing it together, but it is accepted that a lot of the ideas and a lot of the writing came from Russell. I also think that when it comes to trying to think of a new way of doing mathematics, it's not that helpful to speculate on the reality of an historical person like Euclid. Anybody who knows almost anything about the history of mathematics knows that there is nothing known about Euclid, that there is an ascription of an individual who wrote the books called the Elements of Euclid, but actually this is not well attested. We don't know who that individual was or wasn't. I'm very happy to think of Euclid as black. I myself have that idea. But I'm not so happy to think about Euclid as a woman, because I think it was very, very rare in those days for women to have that kind of education. And that's that's just an unfortunate reality. It's just very unlikely. It's not impossible, it's just very unlikely. I don't reject it out of hand, but I just think it's very unlikely. When Professor Raju suggests that there were Indian texts imported into India, into various countries in Europe where calculus was developed, but that the fact that they came from India was suppressed, that's an intriguing idea. There is certainly the possibility that such a transmission route existed, as he suggests, but there is no actual evidence for it. No, I didn't. Sorry. I did take a quick look, and it's not there. So the numerous possibilities that he suggests are intriguing, but I don't think that they're well attested. I may be corrected. But even if they were, the majority of mathematics developed in Europe came later. It was a consequence of what was done in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries in Europe. There's been a flowering of mathematics which is absolutely gigantic. For instance, the mathematics in this phone, very, very little of it goes back directly to the original foundations of calculus. Huge amounts of it come later. In order for the people in this country to get full access to the power of mathematics, we need to do things that really empower people at schools, that really empower people, the teachers, that really develop the teachers. And a lot of that has very little to do with the history of mathematics or with the philosophy of mathematics. It has to do with giving teachers enough time to change, giving them support, allowing teachers to get out of the classroom so that they can do courses and then go back in, giving them promotion if they actually really do develop themselves, getting the schools that would, under apartheid, were told that they were not to teach mathematics, changing that culture around. We still find that the vast majority of the mathematics students at UCT come from the same schools that produced them under apartheid. It is now possible for black people to go to those schools, so now we have black people coming to UCT. But the number of people who come to UCT and do mathematics, who come from the old schools, the Department of Education and Training, the Colored Affairs Department, the Indians always better. Why? That's an interesting question. So we have this whole history of education under apartheid, which hasn't really changed. We don't have to deal with the consequences of the theft of mathematics that happened 500 years ago. We have to deal with the consequences of Hendrik Verwoerd. We have to deal with the consequences of Andries Treurnig. Those are much more recent. They're much more immediate. Okay, I think I'll stop there.
Some more chairs there for those who are tired of sitting down. Aye? The aircon. Okay, can we... the different temperatures in the room. Could we have the aircon? I know it makes a bit of noise, but we need some fresh air. Okay. So we have the second respondent here, Professor Lenley Lefranche from the University of Stellenbosch in the Faculty of Education. He works on curriculum, so he will speak something about that. Thanks.
Can I leave it here? Okay, great. Good evening. It's good to be here, and it's good to be part of this conversation. And it is a space that we would not have had.
Closer to the mic. Put the mic closer.
Okay. Like that? Is that okay? So it's a space that we have to have a conversation which we probably would not have had 2 years or 3 years ago. And it's good to be part of the conversation and to say a few things. And I find myself here as a scholar of curriculum amongst three mathematicians. So I'll say something about maths, but when I do say something about Euclid, I'm meaning that Euclideanism has had real effects. So I actually agree with most of what Professor Raju says or has said. And in the paper that we were given to respond to, this is briefly what he argues. He argues, and he mentioned that again, that science is not objective and it's not universal. And that the decolonization of science can't merely be the issue of pedagogy, but it has to be very deeply connected to with the content of science. And so much of his work is focused on that. I'll raise some issues or questions about that. And then he goes on to propose 3 ways of decolonizing science. And the first is to decolonize the method of validating science. And he's spoken about that around peer review and the whole issue of reputability. And argues, and he hangs on to Popper's notion of refutability. And then the second way of decolonizing science is to decolonize the history and philosophy of science, which he has spoken to today. And then, of course, his argument is that science needs mathematics. So if you're going to decolonize the history and philosophy of science, you must also decolonize the philosophy of mathematics. What he then does is to recommend that the science curriculum, school and university curriculum, should teach students that science is not about it's not about reputability, it's about refutability. And then argues that the science curriculum should have a fully fledged course in a critical history of philosophy of science, which debunks all Western myths, and he spoke about many of them, including Euclid, Archimedes, and so on. And then thirdly, that the decolonization of the science curriculum must be preceded by the decolonization of the mathematics curriculum. So let me start by the fact that science is objective and universal. Now, I've got no quarrels with that. But I want to raise some questions that I would like Professor Raju to respond to. If one accepts the idea that the way in which science should not be validated by reputability, not by peer review or by authority, but by refutability, my question is that not a universal statement? And in what sense are we then talking about universality when we say that science is not universal? Is science multicultural? In what sense is science universal? So let me say something about Euclid, and then move on to issues about curriculum and its real effects. Now, in Plato's Academy, the sign above the door said the following. So I actually want to begin with geometry. Let no one who has not grasped the geometry enter here. That was that hung above the door of Plato's Academy. Now, whoever wrote and produced what supposedly Euclid said happened 1,000 years after what we witnessed, what was witnessed on Plato's above Plato's door and in Plato's Academy. So the sign that hung over the door of Plato's Academy was not demanding a knowledge of established theorems, but an appreciation of a certain mode of thinking, the logical, deductive argument. So what is produced by so-called Euclid was actually a visual metaphor for the logical argument. And Euclid geometry, as I said, became the visual metaphor for the logical argument, offering a picture of how complicated truths could be built up from simpler, self-evident notions. Through Euclid, Plato's geometry became not just a route to truth, but exemplifying the structure of all knowledge. And we know that Descartes championed the logical argument and took this a lot further, and even philosophers, which I am quite happy to engage with, like Spinoza, also built his ethics on Euclidean geometry. And it's interesting that this notion of rightness, which originally referred to how cuttings and markings could fit perfect and ideal right angle. It moved later from literal references in measurements to more figurative applications to matters of morality and ethics. So right penetrated the English language through its Latin root rect, found in words such as correct, direction, rectify, erect, and rectitude. But what all of this, and the traces of this in all spheres of life, and the philosopher Gilbert Ryle was in a sense correct when he said that all of Western philosophy are footnotes to Plato. But it has real effects on things like when we talk about the curriculum, because this notion of linearity and this particular logic that was put forward by both Plato, Euclid, and Descartes was that all relationships would be understood in linear equations of direct causes, predictable outcomes, and a prescribed path. And that's actually the dominant approach that we have to curriculum. And curriculum is based, and that is the roots there, but was perhaps this linear notion of curriculum was exemplified the best in 1945 in Ralph Tyler's work called Tyler's Rationale, where he gives 4 basic linear steps of how we should think about curriculum. Now, none of that has really changed much. And it's called by all kinds of names, whether you call it competency-based education, outcomes-based education, and so on. So my argument that I want to make is to say that whilst I agree that looking at the content, as Professor Raju argues, is crucially important, but we don't actually look at the approach of curriculum, and curriculum itself as an approach is not decolonized, then I think that could be dangerous. Now, in the field of curriculum studies, this notion of Tyler and this linear notion of curriculum, has been challenged and dismissed at least since 1969. But that has not actually moved into the way in which curriculum is practiced in schools and in universities, with certain exceptions, of course. I'm talking about what is dominant. And so maybe I want to suggest to my colleagues who are mathematicians, maybe there's another geometry that could actually be helpful in helping us to think about curriculum differently. And that's fractal geometry. So fractal geometry is a field that was pioneered by many, including Mandelbrot. And a fractal, fractal is characterized by a repetition of similar patterns at ever diminishing scales. So fractal geometry has emerged as one of the most exciting frontiers on the borders between mathematics and information technology, and can be seen by many as the swirling patterns produced by computer graphics. It has become a new tool for modeling in biology, geology, and other natural sciences. Now, instead of thinking about a linear notion of curriculum, what fractal geometry does is to look at recursivity, the importance of iteration, the idea that learning, growth and development and other evolutionary processes we don't necessarily need to see them in terms of progressions or accumulations. The notion of scale dependence, that bodies enfold and are unfolding from bodies. So the notion of the becoming in the whole notion of curriculum, not only the being, but the becoming of the human being in various and in unique ways, and then also self-similarity. But I'll get my mathematicians to comment on the potential of fractal geometry to provide different ways of viewing curriculum. So let me say a few points in general, which are some of my own views. Science is a human endeavor. It's a human enterprise. It's a human interest. And so without human beings, there would be no conversation about science or about mathematics and so on. So there can be no science outside of human will and intention. And so, although we must trouble the notion and we might want to trouble the notion of metaphysics and try and efface metaphysics from the notion of science. Science cannot be free of culture because it has to be culturally produced. And it cannot be free of social relations. So there's always going to be human interest when it comes to science. And even, I want to ask that question to Prof. Raju. So even if we argue for a narrow empiricism or a pure empiricism, is that not in a sense a metaphysical claim or statement? So the other point I want to make, if we argue for the kind of empiricism of what Professor Raju argues for, is there space, which is a particular interest of mine in a lot of my work, for legitimating indigenous knowledge? And where does this conversation about indigenous knowledge and the way in which it must be legitimated and dominant science be decentered, not destroyed, so that there are new spaces, which are third spaces or interstitial spaces, for productive conversation to happen? Where's the space for that, which is very crucial in our discussions in the South African context? I think I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Now our third respondent is Professor Bernard Weiss from the Philosophy Department at UCT. You have 20 minutes too. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, can I just say I'm not one of the mathematicians. I do a bit of philosophy of maths, and I'd like to thank Loretta for the invitation to speak here, because in over 25 years of working, well, maybe not quite 25 years, at least 20 years of working as a philosopher of maths, this is the first time anyone's thought I might have something relevant to say beyond this subject. You might... I might prove that I don't, but let's give it a go. Okay, the attempt to decolonize what we study and teach, it seems to me, will encounter very different challenges as we move from one discipline to another. For those disciplines which explicitly see themselves as in the business of cultural expression, decolonizing path or paths may be more or less hard to find, but the need to take steps is blatant, because proper cultural expression demands an authenticity which refuses simply to ape alien modalities. No doubt all disciplines are in some measure redolent of their cultural settings, but unlike those which aim explicitly at cultural expression, others have different goals, and truth, surely, is primary among them. A cultural setting may influence a discipline's move towards truth, either by distorting that movement, erecting barriers and diversions, or by influencing which of many possible truths it chooses to take an interest in. The first set of influences is obviously pernicious. The latter need not be at all detrimental, but rather might help to guide the discipline towards relevance. Both kinds of influence throw up avenues for decolonization of those disciplines aiming at truth. For colonizing aspects of culture might frustrate practitioners in their pursuit of truth. And indeed, this is one of Professor Raju's complaints against Western science. I'll return to this in a moment. And the interests of practitioners in a science whose goals are imperialist or which serve imperialist agendas are likely to be very different from those in a society which rejects and replaces those goals. Relevance in a distinctively cultural sense may be more or less of an imperative depending on how much it looks beyond itself for direction. Pure mathematics, I think, throws up particular problems for the decolonial enterprise because it aims at truth, it doesn't explicitly aim to be a form of cultural expression, and because it pretends not to look beyond disciplinary boundaries in determining its own direction. Professor Raju's decolonial agenda for mathematics is, it often seems to me, a rejection of pure mathematics. So in some measure, I'll be aiming to defend pure mathematics as an enterprise in the pursuit of truth, which ought to be important to all societies. So let me turn now to Professor Raju's interesting contentions. And my main focus will be on mathematics. But first, let me say a couple of words about what he says about decolonizing the method of validating science. It's difficult to argue against Professor Raju's main contention. Experiment, he claims, is a method of validation in science, and scientific theory should be refutable in Popper's sense. I don't disagree with the general intention here, though I suppose we should note in passing that Popperian science struggles with the notion of validation, works only on refutation. Nonetheless, the point must be conceded. The progress of science should be dictated by sound scientific methodology, not by social influence or reputation. And of course, in the context of decolonial research into the sociology and history of science, we might come across cases in which the criterion of success in science might have been the service of Western imperial ambitions rather than the satisfaction of sound methodology. This may lead to changes in what results we accept and changes too in the practice of science. So let me record my agreement with Professor Raju and simply add the following caveats. First, the influence of reputation in the progress of science is actually not a reason enough to reject the resulting theory, okay? Because we need additionally to see how the influence undermines scientific methodology. Often people do the right thing for the wrong reasons. Second, and I admit this is just a guess, though I think research in this area into the sociology and history of science might change our view about some pieces of science and certainly ought to affect how science is practiced, I think there's likely to be less impact on the teaching of science. And that's because I think those aspects of science that finally reach the classroom are likely to be more entrenched, less controversial, and more widely repeated. Okay, but I'm quite happy to admit that I'm perhaps too sanguine in this. Third, and without wishing to prejudge what we might learn about science in Western societies, the general thought is actually applicable to all science and in all societies. And finally, though the thought might pose a threat to the way some science has been practiced, it doesn't actually challenge Western conceptions of science. And indeed, Professor Raju helps himself to Popper's work, which is a particular exemplar of Western thinking about science. I'm going to pass over Professor Raju's remarks on the history of science, because I don't feel qualified to make any comment, and I'm going to move straight to what he says about the philosophy of maths. And here I'm basing my remarks on his paper, Formal Mathematics as Biased Metaphysics. In that paper, Professor Raju argues that mathematics as practiced in the West has become formal, and in doing so has taken on certain metaphysical presuppositions which, despite pretensions otherwise, are culturally specific and which impose a needlessly complicated non-practical epistemology on mathematics with attendant negative impacts on the pedagogy of the subject. The Western conception of mathematics is founded, it seems, on the following 4 planks: taking the practice of mathematics to involve centrally the construction of proofs, casting mathematics in formal systems, treating mathematical results as necessary, and introducing the notion of infinity into mathematical thinking. And the planks are interconnected in complex ways. I think the account roughly proceeds as follows. Western mathematicians have incorrectly read the history of the subject, and in particular a focus on what Professor Raju calls irrefragable demonstration, as requiring jettison of all empirical reasoning in favor of deductive proof. And casting mathematics in a formal system buttresses this construction of the subject, because such systems can be guaranteed to banish empirical modes of demonstration. Professor Raju highlights the roles here played by Russell and Hilbert. I just want to pause at this point to raise a query. According to Professor Raju, Hilbert's and Russell's motives were identical: the eradication of empirical modes of demonstration in mathematics. And doing so, by making it formal, they rendered mathematics metaphysical. My understanding differs. Russell's chief concern with formalism derived, in fact, I think, from Frege, and both were interested in reducing arithmetic to logic, as we've already heard. Both thought that they could formalize logic itself. The aim of formalism was to weed out all intrusion of intuition, of appeals to what is obvious, from mathematical proof. The aim was to make inference completely explicit, and thus to bring our grasp of mathematical concepts completely within the sway of our reflective intelligence. But Hilbert's aims were rather different. In contrast, he wasn't interested in the structure of mathematical concepts. He'd largely given up on mathematical concepts and instead chose to see mathematical activity in terms of a manipulation of essentially meaningless symbols according to explicitly stated rules. And the nature of such formal maneuvers were to be constrained by consistency, that is, a bar on being able to both derive a sentence and its negation. So he insisted on the need to have a formal system which we could then show to be consistent. But in about 1930, Gödel demonstrated that they're firstly inescapable to the limits of formal systems to capture our mathematical concepts, and secondly, to our ability to furnish such systems with interesting consistency proofs. So both of those motives for constructing formal systems fell away. So interest in formal systems has somewhat waned and found different motivations. So it's not at all clear to me why Professor Raju thinks that the formalism is a pervasive feature of Western conceptions of mathematics, nor can I detect a reason for saying that formalism makes mathematics metaphysical. Formalism simply aims at a kind of explicitness, which can serve very different ends in the case of Hilbert and Russell, and different ends nowadays, where mostly what we're interested in is being able to prove results about the system itself, once it's completely described in a formal manner. Formalism is linked to the universality of mathematics, but for Professor Raju, both questions the fitness of formalism to provide a base for that universality and the claim of universality itself. According to him, formalism provides a metaphysics for mathematics. And as he says, it's an elementary matter of common sense that metaphysics can never be universal. Plainly, my common sense falters here because though one may or may not like them, it seems to me metaphysical theories almost always aim at universality. As it happens, I think there are some metaphysical truths, and these hold universally or of necessity. We'll need to come back to the notion of necessity soon, but let's ponder universality a little longer. So is 2 + 2 = 4 a universal truth? Yes, claims the formalist. But she's ill-placed to do so, says Professor Raju, because we can have formal systems in which 2 + 2 = 5. And so we might, as long as one thinks of the formal system as a system of uninterpreted symbols. But on the intended interpretation, as Professor Raju rightly notes, that captured by the piano axioms, such interpretations are ruled out. But this brings in the metaphysics of infinity, another source, according to Professor Raju, of biased metaphysics. Again, we'll need to come back to that in a moment. But I want to return from those esoteric heights to the humdrum 2 + 2 = 4. Professor Raju writes that it's not universal because, as he says, the practical notion of 2, which derives as an abstraction from the empirical observation of 2 dogs, 2 stones, etc., has nothing to do with formal mathematics. The significant thing I think here is that this conception of things brings our conception of the number of 2 and of numbers generally together with their application, and that's important. But we need to be a bit careful. I don't think that the concept of 2 is just an abstraction from mere observation. The process of abstraction is itself thoroughly obscure. The process of extraction is supposed to bring out what's shared by 2 dogs, 2 stones, etc., but what exactly is that? Rather, it seems to me the conception is a consequence of noticing that elements of groups of 2 things can be paired up with one another, perhaps by pairing each group with a standard intermediary, say a group composed of the digits 1 and 2. Pairing, even though it may be done in thought, is a practice, it's an activity. It's not just an observation. When we pair things off, we count or compare them in terms of cardinality. So what does this tell us about the mathematical truth that 2 + 2 = 4? First, it's not itself an abstraction from an empirical observation of 2 things and 2 other things, and then of 4 things. Nor is it an inductive truth based on counting 2 things, counting 2 other things, and then counting 4 things. Because on views of this sort, mathematics is seen as hinging on kinds of experiment. It doesn't. No, 2 + 2 = 4 registers something completely different. It registers that if one counts 2 things correctly, counts 2 other things correctly, and counts them all correctly, that one will count 4 things. And that's an extremely important, though perhaps subtle, distinction. This isn't a prediction, it's a criterion for having counted correctly. The point is due, I think, to the later Wittgenstein, at least that's where I get it from. And it's that arithmetic is normative over the practice of counting. In other words, it determines when we've counted correctly. And that explains both the felt necessity of mathematics, because no observation of counting could be counted to arithmetic, because we take conformity to arithmetic to be a criterion for having counted correctly. And it explains the link between the necessity of mathematics and its application. So I don't think we can, if we want to focus on practical mathematics and its application, we need to bring in the necessity as well. It also explains why a process of counting 2 dogs, 3 cats, and then 5 animals can be used to establish that 2 + 3 = 5. We don't have to do Russell's proof, which goes through hundreds of pages, although there's probably some sense to Russell's proof. But when we count the animals and come up with a proof that 2 + 3 = 5, this isn't an experiment, it's a proof. Because if the process works, we accept it as a paradigm. It shows something about counting itself, irrespective of whether we're counting shoes or ships, cabbages or kings, democracies or dogmas. Anyone who accepted that 2 red apples and 3 green apples made a group of 5 apples, okay, but had a doubt about the cardinality of a group consisting of 2 bicycles and 3 books, wouldn't have mastered the concept of counting. In this sense, the result of a proof is universal and doesn't need to be repeated. A final comment on this. As I said, proof shows us something about counting itself. It reveals or fixes the nature of the mathematical concept. It establishes not merely that something is true, but why it's true. And insofar as we pursue pure mathematics out of an interest in mathematical concepts, it's central to our practice. So I don't think the aim of proof is infallibility, because of course we can always be infallible in constructing proofs. Proof is important because a proof is conclusive if it's a genuine proof, and proof reveals the nature of our concepts. A wholly empirical philosophy of mathematics has been a feature of some philosophers in the Western tradition, most recently, I suppose, in the guise of Quine's holistic pragmatism. But I think the result is dubiously coherent. It hinges on decisions about how to revise belief in the face of recalcitrant experience. So the idea is we confront experience with a set of beliefs. We confront the world with a set of beliefs and then revise those beliefs in the face of experience. But if the process isn't to be perniciously regressive, the belief about recalcitrance itself cannot be measured by the same yardstick as other beliefs, because otherwise we go into the same process the whole time and never move forwards. So I'm not inclined to think that a belief in the universality of mathematics, nor its necessity, are simply products or ingredients of a biased metaphysics imposed by a formalism which distances itself from its application. Let me make one final comment on the concept of infinity in mathematics. Professor Raju attributes the intrusion of infinity into mathematics as a consequence of a retrograde, biased Western importation from Christian theological thinking. The notion, he writes, is of nil practical value for science and engineering, which require real calculation. 2 points. First, I don't think that the concept of infinity, though tied up with the Western conception of the divine, is itself theological. It surely derives from something much more fundamental, namely the idea of an operation which can be performed on an object and then applied again to the results of so doing. And the idea is encapsulated in the process of forming the successor of any number. You form the successor of a number, but the product of what you've done is itself something which has a successor. It's also present, though, in our grammars. I can speak of Loretta, but I can also speak of the mother of Loretta, the mother of Loretta, and you get the picture. Our grammar itself enables the formation of an infinite set of meaningful grammatical phrases. Moving on from that, even if practical mathematics or real calculation is restricted to finite operation, it encompasses the notion of any such operation, and that itself is to invoke the notion of infinity. You don't have the concept of all finite numbers, the concept of finite things, without having the concept of infinity, precisely because there's an infinite number of finite numbers. Thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone for all the respondents for giving us something to think about. Now we have the space to ask questions directly to Professor Raju, and I would also ask him later on to respond, to answer some of the questions from the respondents. But I'm just mindful that if the discussion between the four of them goes on, we won't have time to get questions from the floor. You are only allowed to ask one question, and please don't preface it, so we can have more questions. Okay, thanks. I'll start here.
All of you.
Could we have a roving mic? Somebody to just...
I can speak loud enough, I think.
Okay.
All of you referred at some time or other to Karl Popper, and you kept using the word refutation. Popperian philosophy hinges on the term falsifiability, and an idea, a hypothesis, is as good as its falsifiability allows it to be. And then no one talked about a fundamental philosophical principle of parsimony. So you come up with an idea or an approach or whatever, and the way to evaluate the merits of that approach or that idea is the extent to which it makes predictions that can be falsified. And because, and I agree with Professor Raju, outside of perhaps pure mathematics, there's no proof, there's no truth, there are very good approximations. You apply the principle of parsimony, which chooses the idea, the proposition, the theory that resists, that is falsified the least. It may seem sloppy to some of us, but that's the way things progress. And then when it gets falsified more than somebody else's idea, then that idea falls away or becomes secondary. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We'll take 3 questions, and so this okay. Yeah.
I think it's Subuma from Maths Department. What I find a bit maybe troubling about the 3 questions, I think I'm loud enough. No, you're not. Maybe outside. So what I find a bit troubling about the responses from the 3 panelists is that the discussion has shifted to metaphysics and the universality of metaphysics, whereas I thought the whole point of coming here is to maybe interrogate how Western metaphysics in particular infiltrates the way physics and maths is done. I don't think we're talking about whether metaphysics is universal. I think every other, and of course, I mean, if I may respond also to the last speaker, I don't think metaphysics is universal. I think different cultures have different, almost have their own projections. And so I don't think metaphysics is universal. But also this discussion is not so much about whether metaphysics is universal, it's more about how do we shift Western metaphysics from shifting the center, as it were, I think.
Okay, thanks. We got that. So okay, we'll have another round of questions, but you have been raising the hand at the back here.
Thank you, Professor Raju. You've mentioned that in Western mathematics there has been this bias of formal mathematics, and that has affected the pedagogy or the approach that we pursue mathematics. So my question is, in the decolonial project, is the focus on the pedagogy of mathematics, or does the metaphysics of mathematics or formal mathematics, does that affect the truth value or the outcomes of our mathematical pursuit?
Sorry, I didn't get it. Repeat it, please.
My question is, you've critiqued the bias in Western mathematics or formal logic as being formal mathematics as part of Western mathematics, and you've mentioned that that has affected or impacted our approach or our pedagogy in mathematics. So my question is, does that bias impact the pedagogy of mathematics, or does it impact the truth value as well? Because I understand mathematics as something that is a priori, right, and a necessary truth, and it's not necessarily contingent on experience or empirical notions for that matter. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Perhaps we could get responses now. If we make them quick, we can have even more questions.
Yeah, very short. Refutability versus falsifiability. Popper said he didn't know enough English, and therefore he used the wrong term falsifiability, which he wanted to change to refutability. So I think that's what he says in Realism and the Aim of Science or somewhere. And so I agree with you about the so-called Occam's razor, and that's mentioned in my book on 11 Pictures of Time. So brevity is the thing, not Occam's razor. So if you have superfluous hypotheses, they should be removed. But I disagree on the question of degree of falsifiability, because the whole issue is about accumulation of hypotheses. And the reason why I'm using the Popperian criterion of refutability is only for that reason. And I'm not taking back my criticism of refutability, which I sent to Popper. I'm only making a concession for the purposes of this discussion that I accept refutability is good because you have so much of accumulation of hypotheses, and you have to eliminate that. I agree with that. I agree with you also that there is a shift in the focus of discussion, that really decolonization is about challenging the authority of the West, and the authority of the West comes in through imposing a particular metaphysics. You better listen to it. You talk of invisible points, you have no means of knowing it, but the textbook will tell you, and the textbook will tell you what the Westerner thinks. And as regards your question, the whole idea of necessary truth and contingent truth is based on an idea of logic. That two-valued logic is somehow, I mean, you're talking of modal logic, so you're talking of two-valued logic. Now, I am talking of temporal logic, which also incidentally affects the issue of computers. That empirically, if you try to decide logic, then you get into something like quantum logic. So that's what I'm advocating when I talk of zeroism. And quantum computers are going to leave behind these computers very quickly. So this theory is dead, and this theory of Alan Turing, which talks of Turing machines, not real computers. And that causes a lot of confusion, for example, with Penrose. Right, talking all the time, you just use the terms interchangeably. They are not interchangeable. A computer has finite memory. A Turing machine has infinite memory. So the two are not, they're just still talking of idealization. So there is a thing from formal mathematics which comes in. But the whole idea of temporal logic, you see, logic is not unique. It's just a myth that logic binds God. And it was a concession made by Al-Ghazali, whom you don't read, whom you don't teach in the philosophy department. So it was an incidental concession made by Al-Ghazali when he was talking about causality, and it's central to Sunni Islam. But what happens here is that this was taken as a belief, two-valued logic binds God, therefore it's universal. Buddhist logic is not universal. Kant says logic has not changed since Aristotle, and therefore it has reached perfection. But from before Aristotle, Buddhist logic is from before Aristotle. There were half a dozen different logics. So the Buddha criticizes a certain eight-valued logic. There is a Jain logic of Syadvad, which is all never studied, which is all erased. And the other part, about when you talk of perfect truth, you see, the trick, which I didn't mention, is that when you are using deductive proof, which you start from anti-empirical or non-empirical hypothesis, you can derive any nonsense conclusion whatsoever. Forget about infallibility. And that's why I gave the example of a rabbit with two horns. That I start with the premise, all animals have two horns. A rabbit is an animal, therefore a rabbit has two horns. It's a perfectly valid piece of deduction. So they all the time talk of deduction and reasoning, but don't talk about the nature of the hypothesis with which you start. And if the nature of the hypothesis with which you start is not testable empirically, it is a metaphysics of infinity, you can reach any nonsense conclusion whatsoever. That is why the church adopted both reasoning and logic in church rational theology. Okay, because it accepted rational theology from Islamic rational theology, but changed it to include authority. So I think that is that. If I can respond to some of the respondents, one or two of them quickly. Yeah.
Okay, so you could respond to
some more questions, and then I
maybe let's have some more questions, and I'll spare some time for you to respond. There was you over there in the middle, and next.
Oh, is it on?
No.
Good evening. I would like to thank you all for your talks this evening, but I would like to make a comment, and I'm not a mathematician, so I guess that makes me a little bit simple. So what I would like to say is I was very pleased to hear Professor Lagrange talk about linking pedagogy to the content that the professor is talking about this evening, the content of mathematics. And it worries me because when we talk about the decolonization of the curriculum, we're talking without a common understanding of curriculum. And pedagogy is a vital part of that. I've heard people talk about teaching, but nowhere have I heard anywhere in the discussion, in particular, what is it that we want to learn? And what are the goals of what we're doing? And I think that we're going to be talking across each other a lot. And we're going to be arguing about that content, and we're going to be arguing about whether it's Western, whether it comes from India, whether it comes from Egypt or Greece. Because we're not clear about what it is we want our education, what are the goals of our education, and what is it we want our students to learn. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
Professor, so in reading this and also what you mentioned regarding
Sorry, where are you?
now I'm right in front of you. Hi. In mentioning the two-value logic, there almost this binary logic of truth and false. So as somebody who's doing decolonial studies at the moment, a premise of a lot of decolonial philosophers in terms of how the logic of colonialism happened was based on the idea of the self and the other, right? The self being the idea of a civilized human being originating as a white man in Western Europe, having access to the right religion, having access to a high degree of knowledge and capacity to think. And then we have the other who is normally the individual from a so-called third world country, kind of, so to speak. And I'm wondering whether there's any relation in terms of that binary thinking of the self and the other towards this truth value of either you are the truth in terms of holding the power and being this element of authority, and this other element of the other, which is almost the non-truth, the white, the black to the white, the woman to the man kind of thing. Because you spoke to metaphysical issues there.
Now I'm going to take the. Okay, let's hope we'll have more time. Can I take you in the middle? Yeah. Well, this is the beginning of the engagement. Professor Raju is here for the whole week.
Well, mine is not really a question, but rather a response to Dr. Luri's suggestion. And I would like to say, the first thing to say is just a quote by Obiko. I think he says that a nation without history is like a car without an engine. This is actually to a response to your suggestion, which was specifically to us as the youth of today. You were saying that more than anything, it would be more important if we focused on what was started by Verwoerd and the others. I'd like to remind you that actually that was a continuation of what started very long time ago. So when you say that, when you have that suggestion to me, basically you're saying we should not even have this kind of conversation, because the reason why we have this kind of conversation, it's even called decolonization. So basically we're talking about something, we are trying to respond or change something that was started many, many years before even apartheid was formalized and called apartheid, because it was long started before. So to say that, I believe we can do all of them. We can change what was started back before apartheid as well as what is happening today, which is the result of apartheid. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah. Okay.
I hope you get me.
Okay, we got that. So let's get the responses first. Professor Raju, and then
regarding your question about the content of mathematics and the goals of math teaching, I can also respond to this, that Plato laid down the goal of mathematics as the upliftment of the soul. If you look at Plato's Republic, he says mathematicians can't reason. I hardly ever saw a mathematician who could reason. Please read Plato's Republic, and in Plato's Meno, I'm talking to him, if you look at Plato's Meno, he says that it is about the upliftment of the soul. The very word mathematics comes from mathesis. And mathesis is recollection of the eternal ideas in the soul. So he's talking about upliftment of the soul to increase virtue, to make the young men of the Republic virtuous and not for any practical applications. However, when I am talking about it, I have very clearly, after all, if I'm teaching in an engineering college, they are not interested in history, they are not interested in philosophy, they are interested only in the practical applications of mathematics to engineering. So you have to show that this works better for engineering applications. And when I talk of zeroism, which by the way was not mentioned by anybody at all in terms of philosophy, it was just completely erased. It was zeroed. So I think that so I have several articles on it which are cited there, and they need to be understood. There's a whole huge philosophy of Nagarjuna Shunyavad. You never heard it. And as the Paulos Mar Gregorius, the patriarch of the Syrian church, told the Pope that if people don't understand Nagarjuna, they should be thought to be as illiterate as those who don't understand Plato and the Western tradition. Of course, the Pope showed him the door, but that's a different matter. So he made that statement publicly. So I think that this is something it's expected. You expected as general knowledge. You should know about Nagarjuna, you should know about Shunyavad, and so on. You should know about zeroism, and I'm talking about it, stuff which I have written. So I think that... let me come to the thing. So we are doing it with very clear, pragmatic goals of improving the applicability of mathematics, improving the why why this calculus without limits, because you can solve harder problems. That's the logic which engineers understand. You can solve harder problems which are not solved in normal calculus courses. For example, if you have a simple pendulum, it leads to Jacobian elliptic functions which are not taught in part of calculus courses. You don't teach how to integrate elliptic integrals. But I teach that in my calculus without limits course. That's how it started. All right, so I think we are very clear about that, but there was not enough time to state it. Thank you for bringing that up. And regarding binary logic, you see the whole project goes, if you say, for example, Hilbert's idea of consistency, as Poincare has said, it is too ambitious. So if I have quasi-truth functional logic, where is the question of consistency? Schrodinger's cat can be both alive and dead. Every proposition does not follow from there. So empirically, your two-valued logic is just an approximation, but now how that would affect the logic of us and the other, that I don't know. I've been listening to this discourse for 25 years. I never could make sense out of it. So you'll have to explain that to me in greater detail. But the idea that your contradiction is going to destroy the world is simply gone. It's simply false. So you can have something which is both true and false. And this is also part of Buddhist logic. It depends on the nature of time. It depends on the structure of time. That's too technical an issue, which I didn't go into. If you have a structured time, you take the temporal logic corresponding to it, and that gives you this sort of thing. And that's how quantum mechanics are. But that's there in this book, so you can take a look. We are discussed in great detail in this book, long ago.
Okay, I think we need people. Okay, so maybe this is the opportunity for you, Professor Raju, to respond to the respondents.
There are just 2 or 3 points which are very critical. The first thing is, let me go to the evidence. Evidence very much there. The Jesuits had a college in Cochin. In 1550, they were mass translating texts on the Toledo model. Church always repeats its successful models. And they translated these books, and I have the handwritten evidence, by the way, documentary evidence, but there is so much circumstantial evidence. You see, it was proof beyond doubt. In history, you have balance of probabilities. But here you have proof beyond doubt because you have the evidence. This was done 20 years ago. I assumed everybody would be familiar with it. So if you are looking at... It was published 20 years ago. It was published 20 years ago. So we talk of circumstantial evidence, we talk of documentary evidence, we talk of motivation and opportunity. So motivation was very strong, navigational problem. You are talking about the opportunity, obviously they were there, they were mass translating text. Talking of circumstantial evidence, Clavius just cogs the whole thing and publishes it in his name. 10 decimal place precision, and he doesn't know enough trigonometry to measure the radius of the earth, which my students can do. Then if you're talking of a Fermat's challenge problem to the European mathematicians, a solved exercise in a text by Bhaskar from 4 centuries earlier. Nobody could solve until Euler came along, and Euler had of course consulted Indian texts because he wrote an article on the Indian calendar and so on. So there's a whole lot of Tychonic model is identical with the model of Nilkant. All right, and the observations that Tycho kept a secret, with which Kepler, after he murdered him, ran away. I don't think he, I mean, this is a statement that others make, that you, right, because Tycho was the, I mean, Kepler was the only person who benefited from Tycho's death, and which was not due to, right, so he got his job, he got his observations, he got everything, and he fudged his data. All right, he fudged his data. Why don't you talk about it? He was a dishonest man. He was an astrologer. Did he believe in astrology? Then he said, you know, it's the gods, it's divine harmony, and so on. Anyway, I don't want to go into all that in too much detail. But let me again mention this issue of women. Women did not have education. What are we talking about? How do you assume that the date is right? The date is wrong. All right, so it was Hypatia. Hypatia, who was murdered in a church, who was raped and murdered in a church. All right, and everybody knows she was a mathematician. How come you don't know about it? Right, you know about it. So women did have education, they could have written. All right, so the date, all the evidence you have got, all the Greek manuscripts say that it was, the elements was based on the lectures of Theon. Hypatia was Theon's daughter. He was the last librarian of the great library of Alexandria. Anyway, let's come back to I must thank you. You made a very fair case presentation of what I said, except for just one point, that I'm not objecting merely to peer review. I'm objecting to secretive peer review. Now, secretive peer review is a method of pre-censorship which should be rejected. Then the issue of is science multicultural? Again, I'm talking about Western science, right? Specifically Western science, and I'm suggesting that there is a whole lot of dogma there which needs to be removed, which needs to be eliminated. All right. Now, Plato's Academy did not do logical deductive arguments. Okay, as I already mentioned, Plato was concerned with the upliftment of the soul. And the book Elements is also a book in the same so-called Neoplatonic tradition that is discussed in great detail here. That it is a book because it starts with so many, there's a whole lot of detail. Please take a look. That it's only about, because that was a time of religious war, when the pagans, so-called, were being brutally decimated. Every last pagan temple in the Roman Empire was destroyed. And so that's the time when the book was written. So if it's written by a different author, you have to read it differently. What was the motivation? What were the social conditions? And so on. Won't go into that. It's discussed here. So, pardon me? That's the story. You see, one story supporting another. What's the evidence for what Cicero said? So we'll come back to that, all right, at a later time. I think that you are completely right. I agree with you that the curriculum has to be decolonized. And what I'm saying is that the present-day curriculum was designed by the church to produce indoctrinated missionaries. So the entire design has to be changed. Because we are talking about a free people, they should be trained differently. You don't want to indoctrinate them. You want them to think on their own critically and question and challenge and do so many things. So you want to, education for freedom is quite different from education for control and slavery. Right? So we need to have that. And of course, I'm not saying pure empiricism. Again, zeroism is very clear. All right, that we accept empirical proofs and accept inference. But inference based on which logic we have to consider. However, you accept both. And this is true for all systems of Indian thought, Indian philosophy, if you're familiar, except for the Lokayat who reject inference as inferior and fallible. Completely the opposite of what is made out in formal mathematics. Why? Because the starting point may be wrong. And there is this famous example of wolf's paws. A man goes at night and he makes wolf's paws footprints on the ground. And from the gate of the city to the center. And then in the morning, a crowd collects and they say a wolf was around. And he laughs because he wants to tell his girlfriend, look at these fools. They have inferred, and they have inferred something completely wrong. The footprints were not made by a wolf. They were made by me, you know that. So, therefore, they rejected deduction, especially from metaphysical premises, as faulty. This is, again, 2,500 years old. All right, so I think that there's one more thing I would like to say, that infinity is a notion due to the West. I didn't say that. I showed you a slide about how the infinite geometric series was summed. I'm just saying that the metaphysics, a particular metaphysics of infinity, allied to church dogmas of infinity, is from the West. And I'm replacing it. I may want to have another metaphysics completely. So how was the infinite geometric series summed in Indian tradition? It was summed using non-Archimedean arithmetic. So the first formula for the sum of an infinite geometric series. Finite geometric series is extremely old. You find it everywhere. You find it in Egypt. You find it, it's at least 5,000 years old. So you find it in a whole lot of things, right? And it's not finitism. So I think once you say that, it's not that. However, again, I think I have responded to some key points, and I think maybe all of you, Bertrand Russell was the last person to do theology. This is something all the time people say, oh, Bertrand Russell didn't believe in God. Neither did Nietzsche. Nietzsche was totally against the church. However, when he talked of his doctrine of eternal recurrence, he fell a victim to the Augustine's dichotomy. I have discussed this, that Bertrand Russell and Nietzsche are examples of people who rejected the church overtly, but they fell victims to its deep-seated cultural notion. After all, he was ultimately a graduate of Cambridge. Whether he believed in God or not doesn't matter.
Okay, thank you very much. We heard a lot about the formal and informal in the discussion. So maybe the formal proceedings should come to an end, and informal discussions will continue. So before you go, I'm going to now ask Professor Feris to. Okay, it's not necessary. Everyone. Professor Ramagonda to come to the fore.
Of course, I'm saying Verma's challenge problem is a short exercise. Now it involves specific numbers. Yes, this is circumstantial evidence.
Okay, we'll have.
They never say that.
Okay, we.
Document is something which you want from Western sources. Here are these guys exactly copied. There are documents of Jesuit sources of how much they were copying. You read it, they're cited here. So you are denying, why are you denying circumstantial evidence?
Okay.
Why are you denying motivation?
All right.
If I want to hang somebody for murder, you expect a written confession from it?
Students.
So, right. No. For
Okay.
murder case, you ask for a document.
Shall we? Okay. I'm glad to see that we have got a heated debate, but it should continue after the formal proceedings have been closed. I just want to announce that the science engagement will take place tomorrow for those who are interested in science engagement. Students in the Faculty of Science have got engagements that they'll take some of these things, I'm sure, in the discussion. So I just want to remind you to attend the engagement. Professor Ramgonda will now do the last item on the agenda.
So the two of us came to the front. Erelwani and Kasturi and I are involved with the CCWG, the Curriculum Change Working Group. It was mentioned at the beginning, and our task is really simple, and it's to thank you all for taking this opportunity for real debate. I think you will agree with me that it's not often that one feels like they are at a university.
Indeed. So we'd like to start off by thanking firstly Professor Raju, and with a small token of appreciation from us. Sorry for my hand. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And our speakers who really came through, and hope you didn't have to fear about this being a career-limiting move. Thank you, Prof. Nuri. Thank you very much. Professor Lefranche, thank you for visiting us from the other side. And Prof. Weiss, thank you. Thank you very much.
We want to thank our chairperson as well. Thank you. Not an easy task, but give my hand. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now there are some eats out.
Just wanted to say thank you also to the Office of the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Transformation, Prof. Loretta Feris, and our colleagues from the unit currently called Haiku. We don't know what name you're going to get in future, Zaida and Cyan. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thanks very much for everyone. There are some eats outside. Okay.